Whenever I hear people's hypothesis and I read the paper, I ask myself this question, right? Is the human race officially on autopilot? Because first we used ChatGPT, for help, but then we used it for everything.
All that and more on today's Mixture of Experts. I'm Tim Hwang, and welcome to Mixture of Experts. Each week, MOE brings together a panel of the innovators who are pushing the frontiers of technology to discuss, debate, and analyze our way through the week's news in artificial intelligence. Today, I'm joined by a great crew. We've got Aaron Baughman, IBM Fellow Master Inventor, Lauren McHugh, Program Director, AI Open Innovation, and joining us, I believe for the very first time, is Martin Keen, Master Inventor. This is going to be a great episode today. We're going to be covering a lot of interesting research. We'll talk about a great paper out of MBER called How People Use ChatGPT, the latest edition of the Anthropic Economic Index, and a paper out of DeepMind on agent economies. We're also going to cover a pretty interesting set of demos called AlterEgo, and also talk about the recent Meta wearable. But first, as always, we've got the news and headlines from Ailey. So Ailey, over to you.
Hey everyone, I'm Eiley McConnon, a tech news writer for IBM Think. I'm here with a few AI headlines you might have missed this week. Google's parent company, Alphabet, joined the $3 trillion club. Yes, that's trillion with a T. Only 3 other companies, besides Alphabet, could brag about having a market cap over $3 trillion. According to a new report from the World Trade Organization, AI could boost the value of trade in goods and services by nearly 40% by 2040. Are you ready for the animal internet? Scientists from the University of Glasgow have taught dogs and parrots to interact with touchscreens. The parrots learned how to use their tongues to play music, and the dogs use their paws to call their friends. Want to dive deeper into some of these topics? Subscribe to the Think newsletter, linked in the show notes. And now back to the episode.
So for the first segment, I really wanted to talk about a really interesting paper that came out of MBER, which is in some ways kind of like the gold standard working papers coming out of the field of economics. And it's a paper entitled How People Use ChatGPT. And in many ways, it's sort of a very straightforward paper that breaks down, I think, for the very first time in a very kind of professional, academic, grounded way, how people are using ChatGPT. And I guess, Lauren, we're very fortunate to have you on the show because I believe you mentioned that David Deming, one of the authors on the paper, actually was your old professor.
That's right.
And so I guess, I don't know, kicking off, I guess maybe I'll give you the, the kind of opening remarks on this one. Curious about like what you thought about the paper and if there's particular things that stood out to you in terms of the trends, anything unexpected, or did this kind of really confirm your biases in terms of how people are using this technology?
Yeah. I mean, I think knowing a little bit about the research behind this, what I appreciate is what it takes to actually try to create a taxonomy around how people are using ChatGPT. And they did that. They had classification for different kind of tasks that people are using it for. And I think what stood out to me was that the number one task was gathering information, which is search. That's ChatGPT is really search GPT. And then what that means from the point of this was to understand the economic impact. Is it really that this is, at least for now, with the main use cases that it's being used for, is this really more of like a search engine 2.0 technology versus, I think the probably hypothesis going in was that this is a net new like category making technology. So I think it's interesting to see how that will evolve. But I also think, too, that, looking at the economic impact of Gen AI through the consumer standalone tool, like ChatGPT itself, is really limiting what I think is probably the bigger economic impact, which is where that technology, like via an API, gets embedded into other software that we use every day. So like, when I can go to Amazon and search, what are great toys for a 5-year-old, or I can go to the New York Times website and search like, what's the latest update on XYZ bill, getting passed in the Senate. To me, those are probably, or I would argue, are going to be the bigger economic impacts than people using Gen AI through a standalone chat interface like ChatGPT.
Yeah. And actually, Martin, we'd love to pull you into this discussion because I think, yeah, Lauren, similar to you, I kind of like read it and I was like, wait a minute. We've been sold this like multi-purpose general use technology. It's just search, and I guess, Martin, I don't know, is that in some ways like kind of a disappointing outcome? It sort of feels like, I guess, Lauren, it seems like the argument you're trying to make is, well, it's still early and all these other types of use cases are maturing. Is there a possibility here, Martin, where just it turns out the main use of AI is just search?
Well, that's certainly what this report indicates is how many people are using it for search. What I found interesting as somebody who really works in education was that the main use case in education, 50% of the use for work in education was for writing, which I think in some respects is not terribly surprising because we see the internet full of AI slop everywhere, right? But it kind of is surprising because large language models today generally are just not very good writers. That that they have a certain writing style, and that writing style is fine and totally legitimate, but it's the same writing style, and no matter how much you prompt it, it always wants to go back to the same way of phrasing things. So initially I saw that and I thought, my goodness, that is a scary thought that
It's
educators
kind of a grim outcome, I guess.
yeah,
It's like-
just using this for writing. But when you look closer, actually 2/3 of the things that are classified with this writing taxonomy are actually not creating new content, but are working on existing content. So editing or critiquing or translating, 2/3 of the use were for those three categories, which makes, I think, a lot more sense because to me, that is where the power of this comes in, that if you give it your own sample of writing, if I'm trying to explain something to a particular audience and I need to put it in terms they will understand, a large language model is pretty good at taking that and acting kind of as a reviewer and as an editor. That's certainly how I use it. So I was comforted to see that a lot of people are in education are doing the same thing.
Yeah, it's the same way I use it as well, as like largely as like kind of it's great as like an editor and a critiquer. Though it's interesting that like kind of like pure just text generation is the really big thing. And I guess I don't know. How do you feel about kind of like sort of? I think Lauren put out like a very interesting hypothesis, and I've used this example before on the show, but I'm going to use it again just because I love it. Is basically like when they first invented the PC, you look at all the ads from the early days of the PC, and they're like, oh well, I don't know, you could maybe use it to store recipes, right? And it like took a while for us to eventually come up with the idea that there's a thing called the spreadsheet, and oh okay, all right, then everything changes for the PC on terms of what you use it for. Do you think there's a similar thing here where basically like we shouldn't be surprised because the chat interface might kind of only be good for like a couple things really? And so like we're still kind of waiting for almost like different ways of interacting with this technology to start to see different results.
Yeah, and think about what some of those uses we might think would be, like coding, for example. But this report showed something like 4% of messages are about coding, which is much less than you would think. And when you look at the benchmarks and so forth, they're very much coding focused. Other things that surprised me in this report were people talk about using this as a therapist. Well, something like less than 2% of messages were actually about relationships and personal reflection, and then games and role playing and that kind of thing. That was like a tiny percentage, less than half a percentage. So the use cases that I think people have initially thought, let's use large language models for, are not necessarily playing out here in what people are actually doing with these models and these chatbots.
That's right. And I think, Aaron, to maybe kind of turn and get your voice into this conversation, I think one of the greatest ironies that I've always thought has happened with LLMs is you have like, very left brain technology generating a very like kind of like wordy, almost kind of like feelings based tech on the other side. And, I had a similar reaction to Martin reading the paper, was almost like, have I just been living in a bubble for all this time? Because, for the last few episodes, like, I don't know, you sample the last 10, 20 episodes of MOE. I think we talk about the code gen applications like every other week. It's like very constantly in our discussion. It's what like a lot of the high profile use cases that people are excited about, Claude Code and et cetera. That's like what people want to talk about. But I think what we're finding here is that that's like a total bubble. If you're interested in mass adoption of this technology, it's like coding's not the thing. So I guess, Aaron, maybe to bring that to a question, not just rant at you, is like, do you think it's actually like, should foundation model providers be like totally changing what they're focusing on? Because it sure seems like you talk to Anthropic, they're spending a lot of time on this code application, but it accounts for like such a tiny slice of what people are doing.
Yeah, whenever I hear people's hypothesis and I read the paper, I ask myself this question, right? Is the human race officially on autopilot? Because first we use ChatGPT, for help. but then we used it for everything.
Uh-huh.
And in this paper, it's become this niche to every day where it's a tool for the tech savvy users, but now it's moving to the consumer tech, just like the internet, smartphones once did. And what really stood out to me was the amount of people that are using, these tools. It's about 10% of the world's population, which it depends on what source you look at. There could be about 800 million people are using it. But the early adopters were professionals. That's where it started. But that's flipped now. We're now 70% of usage are now what we call non-workers, right? And if you look in that paper, the worker profile of what they do, we've discussed some of that here already, where worker profiles used mostly for writing, for example, computer programming. It's really about helping knowledge workers find information in these knowledge intensive jobs. Whereas non-work profile, it's really where AI is being embedded into everyday life, where you want to create images, art, video, multimodal, but to help patterns of life, where you can rewrite this content. And what's neat when you put both of those two groups together, seeking information, practical guidance, and writing, according to this paper, that's about 80% of all the tasks and topics that are used within these models, right? And I think in the future, where we're going, that's alluded to this paper, is that these are not just assistants anymore, but these are agents, like in sports, where you would have an assistant that does your tasks, what you tell your assistant to do, where your agent is sort of constantly in the background working on your behalf. And we're seeing these solopreneurs pop up, where a singular individual has a lot of foresight and foresight with all these tools, right? And it gives these small teams access to expert level tools. But the last point is, even though we have access, the access parity gap is closing, although it still seems as though those countries that have the highest GDP, the people in those countries still have more accessibility to these tools. It still doesn't mean that there's an equal playing field about how to use these tools as an agent.
Yeah, definitely. I do want to get to that because that'll definitely be part of, I think the Anthropic paper, which we'll talk about in the second segment. Before I move on to that, though, I guess maybe a final question, maybe Lauren, to you about kind of business strategy here. And it's, I think, related to Aaron, what you're saying about the future is going to be agents, and those use cases are going to look pretty different as we get agents to come online. It feels like in the near term, if we don't figure out agents, does Google kind of end up winning this game? One of the things we've been tracking at MOE is kind of if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said, Google's out of the game. They're so far behind. They haven't released anything good. But in pretty quick succession, they really seem to be catching up very, very quickly. And I think this kind of report made me think a little bit about if it turns out the majority use case is still search, does that mean that the incumbent search company ultimately kind of triumphs in this game? Most people still go to Google for search. And so very naturally, if you have an AI product around search, the two will kind of go together, right? And so I guess how much do you think this kind of weighs in Google's favor in terms of winning ultimately these kind of early innings of the AI game?
I mean, I really think the fact that search is the number one task, information gathering, they call it, is because there's still a long way to go in the imagination gap of what we could use generative AI for. It's not because that is the singular best application for it. So I really think that from a business strategy perspective, investing in the actual work, I mean, this is really product strategy and product design work to figure out what are the problems that, besides search, that can actually be solved with Gen AI, doing the market research, doing the user research, prototyping solutions. That work has actually been surprisingly limited. And there's just now getting to be this wave of entrepreneurs who are taking that forward. There were 36, I think, AI unicorns this year alone. Unicorns have more than $1 billion valuation. That's crazy. It wasn't, I don't know what the number was for last year or for, 2023, but it was not, I'm sure it was not
sure
that.
Seems like a lot.
Yeah. So I really think that it's not that search will go forward as the most dominant use case. I think, it might, but I think that isn't where we should focus. We should really focus on all the other things that it could do, which might look more like a long tail. But if we invest in figuring out and using creative intelligence to figure out what those things are and then test them and eventually build and scale them, that makes more sense.
Yeah. To me, search implies that it's human driven, that a human has to go in and enter a keyword and search. Whereas I hope in the future, data will find you, where we all become magnets, for the data so that we don't have to actively search, but we have these agents going off already predicting what we want to see and searching for us and then providing us, what we're looking for. And hopefully Google, will be on, and I think they will be on the forefront of some of that.
Yeah, it's a funny kind of future where you like wake up and you're like, oh yeah, this is everything I wanted to like. I didn't even realize that this was what I wanted.
That sounds an awful lot like a social media feed we have today. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily delivering the things that maybe we should be getting, even though it thinks that that's the thing that's going to get the most engagement. So yeah, it will be interesting to think of a world where we're not just trying to send you stuff to maximize the engagement of the stuff that we send you, but it's more personalized to the fact that we think there is some utility in you receiving this information and that you would benefit from it.
I'm going to move us on to our second topic, which I think luckily is like pretty related to a lot of the things that we're touching on. So, not to be, outclassed, Anthropic also has released a major review of how people are using AI technologies. This is the second, I believe, edition of their Anthropic Economic Index. The basic intuition is that they have a lot of people using Claude now. And what they want to do is basically get a better sense of how people are adopting and using AI in the field using the data that they have from operating a platform like Claude. And it's super interesting, and I think there's a lot to go through, but I think the main thing I want to focus on, which is new for this edition of the Anthropic Economic Index, is that they have started to expand their analyses beyond just the United States. And again, I think in the spirit of like getting out of our bubble, like not everybody uses AI for coding. I think it's also really useful for us to think about like the international scene and how that's kind of adopting AI. And so, Aaron, I kind of want to go back and maybe kick off with the point that you had raised, which is you were talking a little bit about the fact that, what Anthropic finds is that there's this kind of relationship between like wealthier countries and adoption of Claude. And there's kind of like this very kind of specific sort of income distribution difference in what they're seeing in the data. Should we, Aaron, be worried about kind of like an AI gap? Like where actually just turns out that like wealthy countries adopt this technology, they get all the benefits, and countries that are maybe relatively poorer don't adopt that technology and are left behind?
Yeah, I think it's important to find the signal in the noise because I don't think it's all about, wealthiness or GDP. What I really liked was the Anthropic AI Usage Index that they introduced, which looked at what they called usage density. And it's like this normalized measure that when they adjust for, let's say, working age, that smaller tech advanced countries are lead in usage per person. Right. So going back to some of Martin's point, it's about the utility. What are people actually getting out of using these tools? Right. Is it useful? Is it actionable? All right. And then how much are they using it? And there certainly is a correlation right in the paper about high income means more usage density. But there were some corners where potentially, there are people who are maybe not in high income countries, but they're learning to work with AI. Right, so they're eventually getting through it. So they called it directively automating task was one place where people are becoming much more familiar with the tools, and lots of this is working out because of these remote technologies. You can go on the internet and take a remote class. You can even watch mixture of experts, right, to learn how all of this technology works, and then begin to go pick up a tool and try to use it. And they're very accessible, which is really nice as well. Right. So, businesses are tending to trust more of these, tools. And that I think is beginning to spill over into individuals adopting this. But it doesn't mean AI adoption is uniform, because it's certainly not. And I do think that we need to be careful, right, about widening this AI gap.
Yeah, Martin, I guess on this education point, it's so funny because I think, when I used to work at an AI startup, the thing we always used to say is like, well, it turns out that LLMs, you can have a natural language conversation with them. And so this is like the seamless, most easy adopt interface because it's just conversation. And like, you don't have to learn to program it. You don't have to read some handbook to learn how to use the interface. You just talk. But it seems here, and I think what Aaron's kind of pointing at is, that there actually is still this like learning curve, even though it is conversation. And so has AI turned out to be harder to learn how to use effectively than we thought?
Yeah, when you see people selling online 100-page prompting guides, it makes you think maybe this
Wait, are we
isn't
just back to where we started?
right. That's right. Suddenly we need a big manual just to be able to talk to this chatbot. I mean, and it's certainly been shown that prompting is still a big part of this. Is understanding intent massively affects the outcome of the model. I mean, I thought it was really interesting the fact that they had lined up all of the countries that were part of this study, and then they did correlate so closely to GDP that the higher the GDP, the higher the percentage of people in that country were actually using the model and maybe getting more utility out of it. But then whenever they do that, it makes me interested to see what doesn't correlate with that line, that straight line. And there are a couple of countries like Singapore and Canada, they significantly over-indexed on that. So something like 4 times the amount of people in Singapore were using ChatGPT than or in this case actually Claude, than you would actually expect, considering the GDP of that country. So it's kind of begs the question: well, what sort of utility are these people getting out of it that other countries are not? And then when you look at India, we mentioned earlier that we think there's so much talk about using these tools for code gen, and actually it wasn't a big part of what ChatGPT usage was. In India, half of all use of Claude were for coding tasks. So you can see again that people in different countries are getting different utility out of these different chatbots.
Lauren, I think there's a way to have the conversation, another way at this conversation, if you will, like that we've been having for the last few minutes, which is like, Tim, you're being a huge dummy, right? It's like, it's kind of no surprise that rich countries adopt Claude more, because the reason why is that like you can spend $200 a month on Claude, right? That it's actually like something that you have to pay for. And like some of these rates to actually like get the better versions of the model are indeed extremely expensive. And I guess I want to ask you, as someone who works in open innovation, thinks a lot about open source and kind of how all those pieces fit together, do you think this map looks very different for open source, right? Like, is this kind of correlation, right? Is there this huge dark matter where it's like, yeah, no surprise they don't use Claude because they don't want to pay for it. They're using open source alternatives that are free and much better. Is that one way of reading this data? Do you buy that?
I think if you look at developer populations in countries, I would guess that amongst developers only, that GDP has much less of an impact, because if you already are trained as a developer, then you have access to all the tools in the world. You can get models, you can get inference engines, you can get valuation frameworks, tuning frameworks, whatever you like. But I think the problem is that developers are a really small percentage of the population in some countries versus much bigger in others. And that's fundamentally an access issue and an economic issue. And I think this whole thing played out pretty much the same way with social media. Like 10, 15 years ago, we were having the same debate of social media is so widely adopted in higher income countries. There's such low adoption in lower income countries. The stakes were a lot lower because I think social media, it's more of like a, has more entertainment value than, like productivity and labor value. But I think what's most important now is what happens next, because when that happened with social media, I was actually living in East Africa at the time, and Facebook made a very, very bold move, which was to create something called internet.org and made these tools available completely for free, working together with the telcos and the internet providers. And I could see how that was received on the ground, and it was a very mixed bag. There, of course, were people who were very excited. And I mean, even today in Kenya, you can, if you run out of data on your cell phone plan, you can still access Facebook because it's negotiated to be for free. And that's because the goal is to make sure that there is access and adoption. But then the other, cohort is that essentially creates like a gatekeeper mechanism. And the big problem with that particular project was that it was a selection of certain websites and tools like Facebook, Wikipedia, and a few others. And in fact, in India, within a year of that being released, it was banned by the government. So they actually said, it's better to have no free internet if it's going to be curated by someone else, with no sense of like net neutrality, potentially creating information monopolies that, the population is not deciding on. So I think that this report helps bring awareness to the issue that right now adoption and access are not equally distributed. I think what happens next needs to account for like how to do this with dignity for the populations it's meant to serve, not really using charity as a cover for actually just creating market dominance in these markets, these emerging markets. I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind now about now that this access gap has been identified, what do we actually do about it and not repeat history.
Yeah. This paper left me with some hope, right, at the end, right, where I was reading it, and I interpreted it this that geography isn't necessarily destiny, but it does help, where you live, and the things that you can do, right. If you do live in a low usage region, you could learn remotely. You could create your own AI exposure. You could find niche industries that could adopt AI, but there's different areas that you can help to close that gap, right? So it could be a grassroots movement to increase the density of usage in these geographies that are looking like there's just no hope, but there is.
I'm going to move us on to our third topic of the day. Interesting paper moving a little bit away from these kind of economic studies to a paper that DeepMind released called Agent Economies. And it's a kind of fun, a little bit of a speculative paper, though I think we can debate about how speculative it is. And the paper specifically looks at the idea that, look, in the future, we're going to have all of these AI agents in the economy. And in many domains, these AI agents may be interacting with one another. And kind of what the paper does is just to simply point out, like, that'll be weird and new, and that we will need to figure out what to do with that. And indeed, that it kind of introduces a number of sort of new risks. And this actually connects to something that we talked about on the last episode, just to kind of recap everybody here and also our listeners. We talked a little bit about the phenomenon of, particularly in job hiring recruiting, we have this world where basically people are starting to use LLMs to submit applications. And then we're starting to see like HR teams and people teams use AI to try to filter through those applications. And there's like a little bit of like an algorithmic war going on there, which, ultimately hasn't been great for anyone. There's an Atlantic article that literally was entitled something to the effect of like, the job market is hell. And so I guess, Martin, I'll kick it over to you. Is like, should we be worried about agent economies? Like, it does feel like in many of the cases I could name, the minute we sort of have automation on both sides of a market, things get a little bit out of control and not always in the best way.
Yeah, and we see this in education as well, that somebody has written some sort of article to explain something in AI, then somebody has used a large language model to summarize the AI summary, and then they're using a large language model to create quiz questions based on the summary that was based on the LLM generated article. Yeah, we're just like, yeah. So yeah, that's obviously it's such an interesting thought to think of the fact that how powerful a particular agent can be, and now what happens if you take that thing that has so much utility and then you connect it to another thing that's just as powerful, another agent, and how does that communication work? I mean, just sort of from the plumbing point of view, I've been looking at that recently, how you integrate these two agents together and using things like the agent-to-agent protocol, the A2A protocol, which is a open source thing that's now part of the Linux Foundation, but originally came from Google. And just seeing how these agents can basically be wrappered so that they can talk to other agents and discover each other and so forth. And the analogy I heard was, it's kind of like making a Lego brick out of an agent. So the number of times in my IT career that I've heard that we are going to take something and we're going to wrap it and it's going to be like a Lego brick that can plug into anything else. I mean, we've been there with SOA, with Corba, microservices. Yeah, here we are again. That helps with discovery, it helps with communication and so forth. But I think this is a whole new scale. This is not talking about a microservice that does one thing, it writes a field to a database. We're talking about agents communicating with other agents, asking them to do things. And then the amount of the processing and complexity in that agent to perform that thing. How do we know that the thing it's going to do is really what we were asking from the original agent and so forth? And as we go down the line, the meaning could get lost as it goes. So yeah, it's really interesting to think how this agent economy would work. What would be the kind of the first use cases for it? And all of the potential unintended consequences from that.
Yeah, for sure. Aaron, are you hopeful here? I mean, so the paper ends on kind of a positive note because I think the authors are trying to like offer a way forwards from a research standpoint. And they pitch this idea of, look, we need to figure out how these economies can be made steerable. And if we can steer these markets in the right direction, we can make sure that they behave properly. And I guess my skepticism on the paper is like, I don't know, one of the most arguably agentified markets is the financial markets, right? People do algorithmic trading all the time, and a huge amount of the volume of the stock market is on algorithmic trading. The stock market has proven to be a really hard thing to try to steer. We're certainly maybe better at it than we used to be. But as far as I understand, I mean, when the market like gets into a crisis mode, the best solution we have is we literally hit what is called a circuit breaker and we stop the market for a period of time and start it again. And so I don't know, are we promised, like, do we feel steerable markets is like a promising frame, or are we going to just be kind of like what we do for financial markets, which is like turn it off and turn it back on again, and you like hope that the system kind of keeps working properly?
Well, I'm waiting for agents to unionize, right, and demand some sort of profit from this, and even demand nap breaks.
Yeah, I mean, they're putting so much work in, right? Like,
right. But I mean, with that, so this reminds me of a field. So whenever I was back in college, I was very interested in evolutionary computing. So I studied artificial life, and that's really the study of how man-made systems could exhibit behaviors that are characteristic of living systems. Now, these agents are becoming very similar to that, but the focus and the enabler around the modern day agents is AI, which is more of a top-down, logic-driven piece, right? And to your question about will these agents be able to solve the problems, for example, in the stock markets of tomorrow and of today? Well, I think that you don't have to be the most powerful agent. You just need to be the most needed agent, right, in order to help solve some of these problems. And it comes down to, can we set the right distribution of fairness, credit assignment, the right kind of incentive for an agent to self-evolve to, so that they can better solve some of these problems. But you're still going to see, I think, traditional machine learning that's going to be embedded into these agents along with Gen AI, and there's going to be some intertwining between both of them. For example, LLMs can use the outputs of, let's say decision trees, support vector machines, and so on, but also it goes in the opposite direction. Common day or traditional machine learning can use the outputs of also LLMs, and they work together. So I think that combination, right, is going to work together to help solve and create this scalable coordination amongst all of these different agents.
So ultimately, I think that is promising. I could see that, right, as a way of kind of like approaching some of these problems. Maybe, Lauren, I'll give you the last word here before we move on to our final topic for the day. Agent economies, are you optimistic? Is this something that you're excited to see?
I think I'm optimistic about what I would see as the next phase, which would be agent companies. So we'd have companies of agents before we get to economies. And of course, I look to what's happening in open source communities to see if that's realistic. And actually, I'm generally the skeptical person on my team. But on this one, there's two projects I've seen that were like jaw-dropping, which is, one is Meta GPT, and it claims to be a software startup of agents. So there's agents to do your product, market research, competitive landscapes, agents to define the requirements to give to the engineering team. And then the engineering team is a team of agents that does the code gen, and then it gets deployed. So it's a, end-to-end software company. That's super cool. It's a super popular project worth checking out. The other, which is mind-boggling to me, is AI Scientist, which is a team of agents that can do its own scientific experiment and come up with a publication and could even try to get that published. So with AI Scientist, this again, it's a popular project. It has like 10,000 stars. It writes its own. You give it a prompt like, what's going to be a more efficient way to use LLMs. It will come up with a hypothesis, design the experiment, create the data or get the data, run the experiments. These are usually experiments about LLMs itself, so it's a little meta. They actually got one of these AI-generated experiments plus papers accepted into ICLR. So they worked with the organizing committee and told them, we're going to submit some AI generated papers to like keep this ethical, like they gave them the heads up, and one of the 3 papers they submitted got accepted. So I think agent economies, I honestly, I can't quite wrap my mind around it, because first, like, let's make agents work better. And then I think the next step from there would be agent companies that create the agent economies.
I'm just wondering, is this like just a giant echo chamber when it's coming up with a hypothesis, it's then coming up with its solution, and then it's peer reviewing itself? Like, is it just going to be, just saying yes to everything?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I do like kind of Aaron's hypothesis is that we'll see like a lot of other phenomena emerge here, where like agents will try to unionize, or like the AI scientists will argue over who gets credit on the paper, or like the AI engineering team is always complaining about what the AI product team's putting together. Like, I think we're about to get there. That's the future of the AI economy. So.
AI bickering.
Yeah, AI bickering. Yeah, you've seen AI cooperation. Get ready for AI bickering. All right, so I'm going to get us to our final topic of the day. And in some ways, I want to tee this up as kind of a tale of 2 wearables. So there was a demo that was released a few weeks back from a startup by the name of AlterEgo. We'll put the link in the notes, I'm sure, and you should just check it out online. You can search it up. And it was a fascinating demo. Basically, the idea was it was just a guy sitting, and he was able to do a bunch of stuff with AI, but there was no visible kind of interface. So there weren't glasses, there wasn't a wearable, there wasn't a pendant he had to wear. It was almost just like a little kind of behind the ear, effectively. And it was really impressive as a demo. And I think they caveated it in an appropriate way. They said, hey, this is still prototype and this is what we're working on, but there's a company doing this right now. And it's very kind of like almost like invisible AI, right? Like the idea that in the future you'll carry an AI companion around, but there won't really be like a device. It'll just be kind of like a small kind of unobtrusive thing that helps to kind of like use computer vision and language models and generative AI as a way of assisting you throughout the day. Split screen, I think, to yesterday, I believe, Meta did a huge event where they demoed a bunch of Meta AI. And their big kind of announcement was this, I believe, multi-$100, $700, $800 wearable with Ray-Ban, which are kind of the next generation of their glasses. And they had a bunch of kind of flops on their live demo. But overall, the reviews have been very, very positive that this might be sort of like the glasses that finally get the AI integration to work. And they showed off some cool stuff like, oh, in the future, it'll display like a translation, sort of captions while you're talking to someone, right? So you could kind of do live translation. You can pull up notes while you're talking to someone. And so I guess, anyways, these are sort of 2 really, really interesting visions, I think, of what the kind of sort of wearable AI future might look like. And I guess maybe, Aaron, I'll kick it over to you. Does one of these visions, are they more compelling to you than another? Like, do you believe in kind of like you're going to have kind of a transparent screen in your glasses and that's how you're going to interact with AI? Or do you kind of believe in this like, fully invisible, it's just kind of an audio voice that you interact with?
Yeah, I mean, there's no free lunch, so it always depends on what environment, we're working in to what solution works out the best. And this reminds me, I worked in biometrics for quite some time, for about 10 years before I'm doing what I'm currently doing. And there are these biometrics called pass thoughts, where if you could measure what you're thinking, then you could get access and authenticate yourself. And this was back in 2005, right? And they would use these different pieces of EEGs to measure brain waves. Whereas this is using what's called EMG, where it's looking at the neuromuscular, facial throat activity that's happening. It's trying to deduce, right, and infer what you're going to say based on those said activations. So you actually have to really think about it, of course, but then intrinsically your muscles have to respond without actually projecting sound out, right? Whereas there are these other non-invasive pieces where you don't have to do that, right? And then if I look back and biomedical engineering work, there's things like fMRIs, there's transcranial magnetic stimulation where you can turn off portions of the brain, and those are somewhat, remote, right? So there's all these spectrums of how do you do this ubiquitous computing, right? Do you wear it? What kind of devices are those, and so on? And as always, I think it's going to be a combination. What I did like about the Ray-Ban is that it used a consumer device that people always use and need, sunglasses, and then they attached on, some kind of tech, around that. Right. So if you could pick an object where someone looks at and it has an affordance, or what to do with it, and then you add in AI because AI is becoming invisible, right? Then I think it becomes very powerful. So the less physically intrusive, the better. And I think this alter ego is getting there, and it's a very interesting way. What I would like to see is more technical work and research has been published, because I did search, and I only was able to find like a paper in 2018, right, about this work. But I was looking for more information, right? How big is the library of vocabulary and so on? So there's just a lot of questions that I had.
Yeah, definitely. And Martin, this goes to something we were talking about a few minutes ago. Interestingly, I was joking a little bit about like, oh, well, ChatGPT, chatbots were supposed to be the easiest interface. And it turns out there's like actually like a lot to learn. And I guess a little bit of what kind of Aaron is saying is like, while theoretically it's better to just be like, I'm thinking about sending a text message and like the AI does it for you, like that's actually kind of almost more difficult than like glasses and like a little thing that is kind of like a mouse that's in my hands, right?
Yeah, I was watching that demo and it looked actually like these guys are really having to concentrate very hard to make this near telepathic wearable actually send a message. And it's supposed to only pass intentional thought, but I'm thinking, is it really only going to pass the things that I want it to? Like, I really hope there's an approval button that before it kind of sends the message, because like I'm answering your question now, Tim, and I'm thinking about how to answer it, but I'm also looking at Laura and I'm thinking, what's that picture frame behind her? I wonder what's in that.
What am I having for dinner
I don't
later
want that
today?
included in the message.
Yeah.
so yeah, it was a very impressive piece of tech, but I always like to look at how there's a bit of a disconnect between the engineering of, hey, let's see if we could create a wearable and it uses some kind of brainwave analysis or something, versus what the marketing department has to do, which is to create this video to sell the product. And you look at the use cases that they had in the video, and one of the use cases is, well, I want to talk to my friend over here. My friend's in the room, but perhaps it's too noisy. So, that is the use case that they decided that if it's too noisy to talk to your friend, you need a wearable that goes over your ear and uses telepathy. Like, could we not just use our phones and send a text message or write down on a piece of paper? Like, and I think back to like when the Apple Watch was released, and that was the idea was, could you take all of the tech from a phone and basically put it into a tiny little watch? And then great, if you can do that, how would we use it? And one of the things from the Apple keynote when that came out was these heart tap backs, where it would measure your pulse, right, and then send it to somebody else, because that used the heart rate monitor that was in there, and it used the haptic engine that was in there. I mean, that is not a problem that I'm sure anybody was trying to solve, and nobody's going to go out and buy a watch for that. And that very quickly disappeared. So it's interesting to see now the kind of use cases. Now, the Meta Ray-Ban display that was announced, I mean, that does look, as Aaron said, that's something that you might already be wearing anyway. So it's not such a problem to have to like bring it with you and put it on. You might have it regardless. But even then, when you look at the use cases, they had things like a person out about town and they looked at a building and they said, what style of architecture is this? And then the AI gave them an answer. Well, yeah, that's kind of cool, but am I going to need to know every day what kind of architecture
I do that
I'm looking at?
4 or 5 times a day.
Right. So trying to find the daily sort of use for these technologies, I think is the real thing. Like with the watch, it turned out the use was fitness tracking and notifications, and that's basically 90% of all uses. So it does make me wonder how some of these AI-powered devices, these things that you wear and are basically screens, how we'll actually end up using them.
Yeah. I thought there was a bit of a miss on the use case. I could quickly think one of the better use cases that I could imagine is the ability to help people who have speech impediments or can't speak, right? Because that's, I looked, and that's about 5 to 10% of the global population. That's as many people that use these Gen AI tools, right? That's about 400 to 800 million people. That's a big market that they would have already had. And it shows a nice use case that's helpful, and it can really create and help create a sense of empathy with their product, between people and product. I would like to see sort of that, come out of this. How can we help humanity better than just being this neat, interesting tech?
Lauren, I'll give you the final word of today's episode. Telepathy, would you pay for it? But more generally, would love kind of your thoughts on this space. I mean, I think like it feels like we're getting skepticism on both sides. It's like, regardless of whether or not it's telepathy or the glasses, I guess what I've heard from Martin and Aaron is, well, we're still waiting on what the good use case is here. I mean, do wearables have a future with AI for now, or is it kind of just still very speculative from your point of view?
I think these two have two very different purposes. I think the glasses are more about making a more convenient or usable interface. So take the technology we have and just make it easier to bring up into your interface that you use with it. I think what's interesting about AlterEgo is it creates a new communication plane, really. Like, we have vocalized language, we have body language, we have facial expressions. This kind of sits in between where you want to say something to someone, but not let the whole room hear it. Do we really need a new communication plane? I feel like in pretty select circumstances, like everyone's been saying. I mean, I do think it would be sometimes convenient if you're in a in-person meeting or at a party and you want to, sometimes it's benign.
I gotta
It's
get out of here.
Yeah, I want to get out of here. Let's go. Or like, hey, Aaron, would you be ready to talk about XYZ case study in this meeting? And I don't want to ask that out loud because it is a distraction. So there are use cases. I'm not sure if they'll be worth the cost of these technologies just yet. But like Aaron also, I think the most compelling use case, it seems like when they were researching this at MIT, one of the main use cases they were focused on was people with MS and other dystrophies to actually help them be able to communicate. That seems like hands down, truly invaluable, worth all of the research that it takes. And then if it can be extended to other more of like, social conveniences, that would be cool. Sure.
That's a great note to end on. That's all the time that we have for today. Lauren, Aaron, always great to have you on the show. And Martin, hope to have you back sometime at MOE. And thanks to all you listeners. If you enjoyed what you heard, you can get us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and podcast platforms everywhere. And we'll see you next week on Mixture of Experts.